Introducing a new pictorial history of Gaithersburg neighbor and Montgomery County's seat of government, Rockville, from the city's award-winning Historic Preservation Organization. Capturing through vintage photos the fascinating 250-year evolution of Rockville from a tiny colonial community to a major suburb of the nation's capital and now one of the most diverse cities in the country. The book's release has been delayed because of the pandemic until the end of June, so here's a preview. We start with this drawing of Rockville in the 1950s, quite different then. We tell the story through thematic chapters: Rockville's early history, the importance of transportation, its role as county seat, schooling, commercial enterprises, community institutions, our diverse neighborhoods, the traumatic chapter of urban renewal in the second half of the 20th century, Rockville's national connections, and finally a reflection on the passage of time. This early map shows how Rockville came to be as a colonial crossroads community at the intersection of roads to Frederick, Georgetown, and Brookville, about the only other nearby town of any size, and then on to the big city of Baltimore. An early visitor was British General Edward Braddock on his way to Canada during the French and Indian War. One soldier's journal provides the first description of Rockville. The spot, then known as Owen's Ordinary for its one tavern, was very dirty, he wrote. Later came another tavern, giving the small community a new name, Hungerford Tavern. The building stood into the 20th century in what is now the heart of Rockville. This sign marks the spot, and it notes that in 1774 residents met here to denounce British oppression, quite early revolutionary sentiments. In 1776, when Montgomery County was carved out of Frederick County, it was logical that this central crossroads community was picked as the county seat, and then came to be known as Montgomery Courthouse. In time, Rockville, most likely derived from Rock Creek, took hold as the name. Here's the earliest depiction of Rockville, a drawing by no less than the architect of the U.S. Capitol, and the earliest known photo. On the right, behind the fence out of view, was an early courthouse. This was a hay scale, a reflection of the farms in the countryside all around Rockville. Churches came along. St. Mary's Catholic Church, as it was first built, our oldest house of worship. An early hotel stood opposite the courthouse, since travel from some parts of the county in those days was more than a one-day undertaking. And by the mid-1800s, the community had a doctor. His small office and grand house was about where the Americana Center is today. The office has been preserved and moved to the grounds of the county's Historical Society. Surrounding the still small town, in addition to farms, were mills. This is Wooten's Mill, as painted by the director of what is now the Smithsonian American Art Museum, when he owned the mill much later in the 20th century. Slavery figured in Rockville's history. This 1850 slave census for Rockville shows many prominent names as slave owners. The enslaved were only enumerated, no names. This is Anne Maria Weems, who escaped from slavery dressed as a coach boy. Hers is a compelling and involved story. Just one indication is an astonishingly large reward her owner offered for her capture. Luckily, that never happened. Josiah Henson was bought and brought to Rockville as a 6-year-old enslaved boy. Much later, he escaped to Canada and published his autobiography, partly for money to buy the freedom of his brother still enslaved in Rockville. Harriet Beecher Stowe based her influential novel Uncle Tom's Cabin on Henson's autobiography, doing much to galvanize anti-slavery sentiment prior to the Civil War. The Civil War impacted Rockville greatly. There were a number of skirmishes in and around Rockville. Union soldiers were stationed just outside the city at the beginning of the war. Allegiances ran the gamut, from Southern sympathizers to Unionist slaveholders, showing how entangled loyalties were. Most notably, Confederate General Jeb Stuart stopped in Rockville on his way to Gettysburg. He spent time rounding up Union sympathizers, delaying his arrival until days into the battle. Had his forces been there from the start, the outcome of that Civil War turning point might have been different. As a crossroads community, transportation is practically a part of Rockville's DNA. The coming of the railroad caused its first growth spurt, and the trolley solidified it as a suburb of the nation's capital. The automobile was next in impacting Rockville. Hard to see in this 1917 photo, but some cars had 2 license plates, one also for D.C. if they were driven there. This other photo was taken just several years after the first traffic light was installed at the original crossroads. Car dealerships came along. Reed Brothers Dodge was a Rockville institution for nearly a century. Can you read the gas price? 15 cents. Here's Rockville's first gas pump. A trolley is in the background. Cars soon transformed Rockville Pike, unpaved until the early 1920s and then just 2 lanes for years, into a commercial mecca. Preceding Congressional Plaza at that spot was yet another form of transportation, Congressional Airport, which almost became the Metro Washington Airport, but then National, now Reagan Airport, was built closer in. Congressional also had an aeronautics school which trained military pilots for World War II. The most famous of those programs was at Tuskegee, Alabama, to train the first African American pilots. And finally, regarding transportation, in the 1980s, with the coming of Metro, the old literally made way for the new. As the seat of county government, Rockville has boasted a series of courthouses for all manner of county matters. Municipal government has morphed also. Rockville was incorporated as a town in 1860, then adopted its current mayor and council form of government in 1888. But they didn't get a permanent home until 1954 in a historic house, replaced by the present City Hall in 1962. Seen here is Rose Krasnow, the first popularly elected woman mayor, a quarter of a century ago. Speaking of notable government officials, this is Walter Johnson, some say the best pitcher of all time, when he was a Montgomery County commissioner. He's here on a ball field in Rockville, giving some kids pitching tips. Although he didn't live in Rockville, he is buried here, and still today fans leave baseballs on his gravestone. In the mid-20th century, government services expanded tremendously. City officials celebrated a new municipal water system, bought a grand mansion as an event venue, here's what it looked like years earlier, built a theater on the property, here it is today, opened one of the first municipal swimming pools, built a rec center, originally for teens. For seniors, some activities were first offered in an old water pump house. Then came today's senior center. As the county seat, Rockville has led the way in education, beginning with Rockville Academy, essentially a private institution for those who could afford it. Its replacement building stands today. Public education got its start a bit earlier in Rockville than most everywhere else in the county, with a one-room school around 1860. This larger school came a bit later. The same year, a public school opened for African American children, as schools were segregated. But there are records of a school started by the black community just after the Civil War, meeting in the basement of what is now the historic Jerusalem Mount Pleasant United Methodist Church. Rockville was home to the county's first high school for white students. It wasn't until 2 decades later that a high school for African American students opened, also in Rockville. With the county initially providing no transportation, the black community pooled resources to buy a second-hand bus. Finally, a modern high school, though still the only one in the county. In the 1950s, when desegregation came about and baby boomers were school age, schools were built one right after another. 5 new elementary schools, including what today is Bell Elementary. and one of the county's largest junior high schools, all in that decade, with even more in the 1960s. Even so, the schools were overcrowded, and Glenview Mansion was temporarily pressed into service for the overflow. And higher education. This is the Rockville campus of Montgomery, then Junior College. Hard to see, that's I-270 in the background, only 2 lanes in each direction, officially U.S. Route 240 then. Now a quick look at Rockville businesses. For a century, Rockville's downtown business district straddled East Montgomery Avenue, running from the original Crossroads, now Washington Street at Courthouse Square, right through what is Americana Center today. A fixture for more than half a century was Vincent's Pharmacy. Its soda fountain has a new home today in Rockville Memorial Library. Rockville has had a number of striking bank buildings. One bank was even able to print its own money. Perhaps Rockville's oldest business still in existence, you know what they say about death and taxes. Rockville hotels for a time beckoned Washington residents as resorts to escape the city's summer heat. On the left is Chestnut Lodge, which started as a hotel. The Corcoran hung on, in a manner of speaking. This gives you an idea of what Rockville's main business street looked like much later. Another business icon, the hardware store, in the 19th century and as the building is restored today. And the evolution to a do-it-yourself hardware home improvement store in the 20th century. Rockville had a downtown movie theater, also the only drive-in in the county, and even a radio station, a top 40 rocker that competed with 2 others in the Metro DC area, blasting out the hits from a rather unlikely spot, a historic home of a one-time mayor.
Rockville, Maryland, 1600, WINX, Action Radio.
By the middle of the 20th century, Congressional Plaza and even in-town shopping centers were drawing customers away from the central business district. Stay tuned for what happened as a result. Some of you may know this shopping center for a later grocery store. Dawson's Market occupies the parking lot in the foreground today. We move on to community institutions. More churches came along. This African American church once stood as part of a black community that was displaced by that shopping center. During the Civil War, white Methodists formed a separate church. It's the building covered with stone that is Rockville United Methodist today. Nearby, Christ Episcopal has weathered some hard times. A secular gathering spot, not a town hall as we think of it today, more a cultural institution for lectures, plays, and musical performances. For nearly 100 years, Rockville's Fairgrounds was another community gathering spot. Its racetrack featured first horses, then sports cars. The fairgrounds were taken over in 1942 with this building, replacing the old high school after it was destroyed by fire. This building was expanded many times over the next decades. Its football field was the old fairgrounds track, and that's where the current Richard Montgomery sits today. Since it descends from that first county high school, Richard Montgomery is the oldest of the county's 26 high schools today. Other community institutions got their start as volunteer efforts. The library, many Rockvillians remember, began that way, and of course, so did the Rockville Volunteer Fire Department. A community tradition, the Memorial Day Parade, actually begun by the black community, with this band often leading the parade. In the past, communities played against each other in sports, but reflecting the times, even this was segregated. Here, Rockville's black baseball team poses at DC's old Griffith Stadium. Rockville today is a city of distinct neighborhoods. From this, the oldest residence in Rockville at 5 North Adams Street, actually the 2-story portion at the far end, Rockville grew. First came West End Park, billed by its developer as an unrivaled Peerless place to live, hence the name Peerless Rockville. The West End has always been quite fashionable. Here's a postcard even. But then so was the other end of Montgomery Avenue. East Montgomery had a residential section. Here's that spot today, roughly speaking. Lincoln Park, one of the first subdivisions in the county, marketed specifically to African Americans. It offered narrow lots, hence this still-standing, stand-alone townhouse. Two notable Lincoln Park residents, one who played for the Negro Leagues and the other a renowned linguist. Very important in terms of Rockville's development was the post-World War II boom, when housing could hardly be built fast enough. Here is one of the developers of Twinbrook, ultimately Rockville's largest subdivision. Its name originally hyphenated for two tributaries of Rock Creek. Other subdivisions soon followed. Hungerford, originally Hungerford Town, Newmark Commons, the same today as when first built, Woodley Gardens, one of the first developments built complete with a community pool and shopping center as seen here today, and then fairly soon College Gardens. Its original name didn't take hold. More recently, the area's last major farm gave way to another development. While the barn that served the metro area's largest dairy is still there, also among the large mixed-use development is a park honoring a remarkable boy who lived his short life in King Farm, Matty Stepanek, a peace advocate and writer of inspirational poetry, co-authoring one book with President Jimmy Carter, and appearing as a muscular dystrophy ambassador on Oprah Winfrey's program several times. She came unannounced at the dedication of Matty's statue. Getting back down to business for a moment, here's Rockville's once thriving business core along East Montgomery Avenue. But by the 1960s, the city's business district was becoming run down, and so Rockville became one of the first small cities in the nation to undertake urban renewal, a massive demolition of its business area and some homes, to make way for Americana Center and an indoor shopping mall. Despite a packed and exciting opening, Rockville Mall failed to gain any national chains as tenants, and the large, imposing concrete structure struck many would-be shoppers as forbidding. The underground parking garage seemed dark and dangerous. Shoppers dwindled. The mall's owner went bankrupt within a decade. It fell victim to the wrecking ball following a campaign by Mayor Doug Duncan. Even the New York Times took notice. Little known, though, is that a portion survives in somewhat altered appearance as the 255 Rockville Pike office building. Well, in bits and pieces, starting with the Regal Theater, new development came together to give us the vibrant Rockville town center we know today. We wrap up with a look at Rockville's remarkable connections to national figures and events. Perhaps the most famous is a person who never lived here but does rest in peace here, jazz-age novelist F. Scott Fitzgerald, with equally famous authors now visiting yearly for the F. Scott Fitzgerald Literary Festival. A storied institution, literally and figuratively, was Chestnut Lodge. It became one of the nation's preeminent psychiatric facilities, and known especially for the pioneering psychotherapist Dr. Frida Fromm-Reichmann. One of her patients wrote a best-selling novel based on her stay there. And in the 1960s, a film starring Warren Beatty was set there, featuring a local celebrity of sorts, Lucy Smith, filmed in her own house with Beatty. Rockville's movie theater, The Villa, which later screened the movie, even had a cameo appearance. Our old post office, now police station, built with New Deal funding during the Great Depression, still has its iconic mural of Sugarloaf Mountain, picked just last year as one of 5 such murals in post offices all around the country to be a postage stamp. In 1935, a horrific school bus train crash at a railroad crossing that no longer exists prompted President Franklin D. Roosevelt to call for safer crossings nationwide. In 1937, a young Thurgood Marshall Later, the first African-American Supreme Court justice was here with two other civil rights lawyers. There they are, leaning against the front stonework of the gray courthouse to argue a case on behalf of William Gibbs, a teacher at the Rockville Elementary School for black students, just blocks away. Gibbs, like his African-American colleagues, was paid half what white teachers earned. The resulting victory, equalizing salaries, was an early step in Marshall's quest to overturn school segregation throughout the South, as indeed the Supreme Court ruled in a landmark 1954 decision. To commemorate this, on Gibbs Street today, is this work of art dedicated to Mr. Gibbs. The later civil rights movement played out in Rockville when protesters challenged denial of service in some restaurants. This sit-in was just months after the very first well-known lunch counter sit-in in Greensboro, North Carolina. And about a decade later, this nearby telephone booth is believed to be where James McCord got instructions from the White House to break into the Watergate headquarters of the Democratic Party. And, of course, the rest is history. Big history. This is just one of two Rockville Watergate connections mentioned in the book. After failing a trial period at the Washington Post, Bob Woodward spent a year reporting out of Rockville for the Montgomery County Sentinel. He then returned to the Post and made history with Carl Bernstein, uncovering the Watergate scandal. And before there was Woodward and Bernstein, there was Woodward and Bancroft, who rated all the county's high school principals. You might say this was only slightly less controversial than Watergate turned out to be. One principal who was rated unsuited sued for libel, ultimately unsuccessfully. We conclude with a reflection on time as symbolized by the town clock, front and center on the book's cover. Unfortunately, the clock stood only for about 2 decades. Its time ended when hit by a car. A replacement was installed and later moved in front of Rockville Mall. When the mall was demolished, it got a new home, where it is today. Fittingly, back on a slightly relocated East Montgomery Avenue, in front of the Regal Theater, which had so much to do with attracting residents back downtown, something the Rockville Mall had failed to do. So if you're interested in the book, with many more photos than shown here, please visit Peerless Rockville's website. The book is an important fundraiser for Peerless Rockville in these difficult times, and ordering through Peerless Rockville provides maximum support to the organization. Thank you.